It is easy to read the Gospels as a loose collection of miracles and broad moral teachings. 2,000 years of historical distance tends to flatten the story. It smooths out the edges until the narrative feels like safe, familiar history. But look at how Jesus actually launched his public work. He walks into the synagogue in Nazareth, the town where he grew up, and someone hands him the scroll of Isaiah. He unrolls it to chapter 61 and reads a promise: good news for the poor, freedom for the captives, and the year of the Lord's favor. This chart visualizes a concept tied to that passage, a radical economic and social reset known as the Jubilee. According to Leviticus, during a Jubilee cycle, the entire economic system was supposed to hit zero. Debts were canceled, enslaved people were freed, and land was returned to its original families. By choosing this text, Jesus was anchoring his arrival in liberation imagery. Jesus stopped reading mid-sentence. The very next phrase in Isaiah 61 is, "and the day of vengeance of our God." He read the part about freedom and healing, closed the scroll before reaching the vengeance line, and sat down. He then told the room that the scripture was fulfilled right then in their hearing. This was a calculated move. In a room full of neighbors who watched him grow up, he claimed to be the person Isaiah wrote about 7 centuries earlier. By drawing a line in the middle of a verse, he was announcing that the era of mercy was open, while the half concerning judgment belonged to a different time. If you were launching a messianic movement, the logical base of operations was Jerusalem. The religious elite, the temple system, and the Roman administration were all concentrated there. That was the center of influence. Instead, Jesus started in Galilee. It was a heavily mixed, marginalized border region that the religious establishment looked down on. Nazareth itself only had a few hundred residents, a town so small it was essentially a punchline. This visual represents the mathematical statement he made next. By going up on a mountain and gathering exactly 12 men from his followers, he invoked the original 12 tribes of Israel, 10 of which had been scattered centuries earlier. He was declaring that the restoration of the fractured nation had begun. He bypassed the priests, the trained scribes, and the wealthy patrons. He chose uneducated fishermen, a tax collector employed by Rome, and a zealot who likely belonged to an armed resistance group. He put them in the same room and formed a team. The traditional mechanics of influence dictate that you start at the center of power and let your authority trickle down. Jesus designed his movement to start at the overlooked margins and work inward. As a rabbi, Jesus ignored the established rules of instruction. First-century religious teaching operated on an oral system of footnotes, where a rabbi validated his words by citing previous teachers. Jesus bypassed this entirely, teaching as if he himself were the source of the law. He also repeatedly healed people on the Sabbath. He restored a man's withered hand, gave sight to a blind man, and healed a woman who had been bent over for 18 years. None of these were life-threatening emergencies that required immediate action to save a life. He chose the Sabbath to provoke a direct conflict over what the day was actually for. By his time, religious leaders had built a massive protective fence of 39 categories of forbidden work around the Sabbath command. Jesus used these healings to argue the day was designed for human liberation, not legalistic exhaustion. He carried this subversion into his conversations. He delivered his longest and most profound theological discourse to a socially exiled Samaritan woman at a well, crossing strict boundaries of both gender and centuries-old ethnic hostility. By setting his own terms for the Sabbath and prioritizing a marginalized outsider for deepest teaching, he demonstrated that his authority functioned independently of established religious structures. This strategy extended to the physical world through his treatment of the purity code. Under Levitical law, coming into contact with a leper, a corpse, or a bleeding woman made a person ceremonially unclean. This network diagram illustrates the expected flow of contamination. Impurity spread from the unclean to the clean. Yet Jesus actively stretched out his hand to touch lepers and the dead. He reversed the flow of decay. Purity moved outward from him, making cleanliness contagious. This inversion included his female followers. Women supported his ministry financially, and the gospel writers record them as the first witnesses to his resurrection, a detail they maintained even though a woman's testimony was not legally valid in that culture. This was his consistent pattern of operation. Instead of observing human suffering from a sterilized distance, he stepped into the contamination to rewrite the rules of what was considered whole. The narrative of the Gospels points to a consistent direction. God's kingdom functions from the bottom up, starting at the margins and moving toward the center through those who were originally written off. Which brings us right back to Nazareth, and the moment Jesus stopped reading from the scroll of Isaiah. We are currently living inside the physical gap between the two halves of that verse. We are living in an unfinished sentence, the enduring space between mercy and judgment. Because his work targets the margins, he does not demand perfection before he arrives. The center of the kingdom is simply wherever he is, waiting for anyone willing to meet him in that messy space between belief and unbelief.